So, greetings, everyone, and welcome to this discussion, interview, conversation, really, with author Thomas Calnan Sorenson, who actually Reverend Sorenson, who's author of a study that I think is of real interest and importance to those concerned with 19th and early 20th century Russian culture, also with political philosophy in the past century or more. And it's of interest indirectly to um, classes that I teach related to Dostoevsky's fictional writing. Indirectly, it's related as context for that. I also think it's directly probably of interest to a number of Orthodox Christians in America who may be curious but may not know that much about pre-revolutionary Russian political philosophy. So it's of interest in that regard. And I think people who are interested in Western political philosophy related to conservatism with its roots in the writings of Edmund Burke in particular may be very interested also in the conversation and in Reverend Sorenson's scholarship here. So maybe I'll turn this over to you if that's okay, and maybe you could tell us a little bit about yourself and also how you got into this fascinating topic originally.
Sure. Well, I'm the author of a book titled Reflections on a Russian Statesman. It's about somebody named Konstantin Petrovich Pobedonostsev. He was various things in the Imperial Russian government from the late 1850s until 1905. His most prominent position from 1880 to 1905 was over procurator of the Holy Synod of the Russian Orthodox Church. That doesn't make him a churchman. It almost makes him something like a government minister for the Orthodox Church. But he has a reputation among Russian historians and people who know about such things as a really black reactionary and as the power behind the throne in the reigns of the last two czars, Alexander III and Nicholas II. Decades ago, I was a graduate student at the University of Washington, working with a very prominent Russian historian named Don Treadgold. And we got to the point where I needed to start working on a PhD dissertation. He directed me to a book called Puti Ruskого Bogoslovia, The Paths of Russian Theology, by a Father Florovsky, a very well-respected writer and book. And in that book, he says that Pobedonostsev was a conservative in the tradition of Edmund Burke. And Dr. Treadgold suggested that maybe I would want to follow up on that and see where it would lead. So I did. And a few years later, that resulted in a PhD dissertation. And then about 4 years ago or so, I turned that PhD dissertation into this book with some revisions in the way it's organized. But the book is one of two that I know of in English on Pobedonostsev. The other one was published before I wrote the dissertation by Professor Robert Burns of Indiana University. And it's a good enough book. It'll tell you a good deal about Pobedonostsev, but it doesn't tell you all that much about his thought, about his political philosophy. And so that's what I set out to develop in my PhD dissertation, and it's developed in the book.
Yeah, and I would just add that I really highly recommend your book and your study. I'm a professor of literature, so I'm not a historian, although I have a background in historical work related to my literature work. But I had found that earlier study that you mentioned, which is called Pobedonostsev, His Life and Thought by Burns, Byrnes. And
Yeah,
I found it helpful in terms of background, but kind of unsatisfying
yeah,
because it did not get into the thought of this important Russian thinker, as you
yeah,
mentioned. And there are reprints of one of Pobedonostev's books. This is Reflections of a Russian Statesman, one that's in
yeah,
English. Um, so, it was possible to garner some things about his thought from that and from the Burns book, but really until recently, when I acquired your book, I hadn't really had a very good picture or background, which your study really provided. And I know that you were over doing research in Moscow and at the time Leningrad, I think, for about a year.
yes,
Uh, so
yeah,
a lot of uh, Pobedonostev's writings in Russian and the archives, publications, and things you had looked
mhm,
at. So
yeah.
I think it's a really tremendous work here, and I'm just going to plug it once more. I probably will again at
Hey,
the end
thank
here.
you.
But Reflections on a Russian Statesman by Thomas Kalnin Sorenson, and and I'll just add also that the analogies you found with Edmund Burke um, really do a lot to contextualize for me,
Mhm.
Pobedonosttsev's thinking and place in intellectual philosophical history, even within Orthodox Christian thinking, because I'm also
Yes,
a Russian Orthodox priest, uh, that I didn't really. I hadn't made those connections before so much, and being familiar with Burke's work, I think you do take Pobedonostev's uh, work and position out of a simple stereotype that you indicated earlier, and
yeah,
it's much more nuanced. And so, thank you so much for this work. And I'll sort of add, if this is okay, forgive me if not, but you're from our earlier conversations, you're not necessarily a Burkean conservative yourself,
no,
and right, and you're, I believe, a United Church of Christ minister, and that tends to be a denomination that is active in social justice issues and so
yes,
forth. So, but you bring, I think, an admirably fair-minded and whatever effort we can make at being objective, whether that's possible or not, as human beings, I think you bring a fair-minded, contextualized approach to this topic, which
well,
is helpful. So,
that's how I was trained to do history, is get your prejudices, your biases out of it to the extent that you can, and just discover what was really there at the time, or the the area that you're working in.
I wonder if in the book you speak about his philosophy and thought as a kind of populist conservatism, and
Yes,
and also to some extent a Christian populist conservatism or some kind of combination, of those terms.
yeah, yeah.
And I wonder if you could just expand on that a little bit, if you could give those who may be watching this conversation a little bit of a profile of necessity, concise about his work, and in those terms, populist,
Yeah,
conservative, also
sure.
Christian too.
Pobedonostsev was significant in the imperial government, not as powerful as his reputation says he was, but he was opposed to any kind of modification of the Russian autocracy, that is, any limitation on the power of the Tsar, the emperor. And he had three sort of foundational conceptions that ground his thinking. They are commitment to the autocracy, commitment to the Russian Orthodox Church, and a kind of commitment to the Russian people, the people collectively. And he saw those three as all intertwined and connected and mutually supportive. The populist part of how I characterize him has to do with his attitude toward the Russian people. Um, he knew that there were a lot of limitations with them. I mean, he knew about the poverty, which was almost universal. He knew about drinking too much vodka, which was also almost universal, and sadly still is in Russia. Um, but he considered the people uh, as the foundation for a system that had developed over time through history. There are two conceptions in Burke that were important for him. They're called uh, prejudice and prescription. And Burkean conservatism says that institutions are legitimate, are legitimated by those two concepts. And what they mean is prejudice is the commitment of a people to an institution, and prescription is the development of that institution through history. That it is political institutions that developed through the history of a particular people that are legitimate, and that it's a big mistake to try to change them and impose something else on that people. And his prime example is the French Revolution of the late 18th century, which he thought was a complete disaster. And in many ways it was. For Pobedonostsev, that meant you don't change anything significantly in Russia. Now, he was involved to some extent in a reform of the Russian judicial system that came out in 1864, I think, as part of the great reforms of a czar called Alexander II. But his work in that area of civil, he became one of the primary Russian experts in civil law. And his work on the reform was very technical. And he didn't much like the way other people who were working on the reform were trying to bring in Western institutions, because he says they're foreign to the Russian people. He has a reputation as having been a liberal back then in the 1860s, and he really wasn't. The foundations of his thought, you already find them in his earliest writings from 1859 and thereafter. He became the tutor of the heir to the throne in civil law. He's a lawyer. He's not a churchman. And he tutored an heir to the throne named Nicholas who died, and then he tutored the heir to the throne who became Alexander III, and the heir who became Nicholas II, the last of the czars. And that's how he sort of got in with the imperial family. Tsar Alexander II was assassinated in 1881. And at the time, Alexander II was just about to sign something that's called the Laris-Melikov Constitution. Now, it really wasn't a constitution, and it really didn't change autocracy, but it did create a representative body that could draft legislation and propose it to the czar. And Pobedonostsev was vehemently opposed even to changing the autocracy that much. And so he outmaneuvered the people who were working on that Laris-Melikov Constitution and wrote and had Alexander III issue very early in his reign a reaffirmation of autocracy that said that the autocracy stays where it is. It's not going to change. And Alexander III was, in fact, a very conservative czar. Nicholas II was mostly a very incompetent czar. But that's his connection with the imperial family, and that getting Alexander III to issue that reaffirmation of autocracy is the one point in his career where he really kind of was the power behind the throne. Now, he has a reputation for having been that all through the reigns of Alexander III and Nicholas II. And he really wasn't, except at that one point. He grounds everything in what he takes to be the Russian people's commitment to both the autocratic government, to the Tsar, and to the Russian Orthodox Church. He's not a churchman, but he is a devout Russian Orthodox Christian. He found the liturgy of the Russian Orthodox Church very moving, very powerful, which it is, if you've ever seen it. But he's no theologian. He doesn't ever really talk about theology. He just talks about the Russian Orthodox Church as one of the institutions that is foundational to Russia. And you don't change that. You don't change it because it has developed through history, and you don't change it because of the people's commitment to it. That's the Burkean aspect. Now, as near as I was able to tell, Pobedonostsev never read Burke. But he did read Thomas Carlyle, another English writer who was influenced by Burke, and it was the Burkean elements in Carlyle's writing that Pobedonostsev was attracted to. Pobedonostsev is very Russian, but one of the big tensions in Russia in the 19th century, and probably even still today, was between historical Russia and its historical development and its commitment to orthodoxy on the one hand, and Western intellectual traditions on the other. And the educated classes in Russia all through the 19th century were all tied up with reading Western stuff. Some of them became socialists, some of them became Marxists. But the intellectual culture of Russia was largely Western, whereas the popular culture of the ordinary people wasn't. It was, people were living very much the way they had for centuries, even though Alexander II ended serfdom, which was a system by which peasants weren't exactly slaves, but they were not free to leave the land that they worked. Alexander II ended that. And Pobedonostsev actually thought that was a good thing, even though it was a very fundamental change in the structure of the life of most Russians. Pobedonostsev is in that intellectual class who's spending all of his time, his reading is all in Western sources. You don't see him talking about having read, any of the ancient texts of the Orthodox tradition. He reads Carlyle and he reads a group of people called German historicists, Karas and others, and he got some Burkean elements through them too. So personally, he's actually quite Western, but he still has this commitment to the Russian people and the structures, the foundational structures of Russian life. The people, the Orthodox Church, and the autocracy.
From the standpoint of literature, I would just add as an aside that those people who are watching who may have read or be familiar with War and Peace by Tolstoy, of course, very famous
Yes,
19th century
yeah,
Russian
sure.
novel, may wonder why so much of that novel involves conversations in French among the aristocracy.
Uh-huh.
That's
Yeah,
a
yeah. Well, that's
of what you're saying. I think even Dostoevsky, who had some interconnections with Pobedonostsev, uh, I think both of them, maybe to some extent, in their own spheres, they tried to find an adjustment between the so-called Petrine reforms, the reforms of Peter the Great,
yeah.
and ideas of traditional Russia that were common in Slavophile circles. So
Mhm.
I think both of these figures, from your study and then also Dostoevsky as well, they somewhat took as existing fact what Peter the Great had done, unlike some of the Slavophiles
Yes,
who really wanted to push back
yes,
against all perceived change. And so, in some ways, the freeing of the serfs, accepting that, very complicated thing, but also, I think with uh, s- s- um, when you in your book you reference uh, uh, Pobedonostev's attitude towards what was called society. I'm looking for the Russian word
yeah.
here. Um, uh,
Общество.
yes, Ultrasta. Thank you. And in some ways, I think maybe this is an incorrect translation into modern American. Sometimes, at least a while ago, you used to hear references to the chattering classes, right? The
Yeah,
intellectuals, the
yeah,
media, educators, maybe even top corporate people who operated at a sort of high rhetorical level. That would be society in the same way that, or somewhat parallel to how Pyotr Onostev referred to society, and seeing a kind of separation between society in that terms, meaning again that the chattering classes, I'm using that sort of
yes.
humorous phrase, a gap between that and the people at large
Absolutely, yeah.
that he referred to, I think, as the Narod. Am I pronouncing that correctly? Yeah.
Narod is
Narod.
is the
Yeah.
is the Russian word that I'm translating as people, which is how you have to translate it, but English doesn't really have a word that means quite exactly the same thing. In Russian, narod and in German, folk
Mhm.
mean the people of a country, of a culture collectively.
Mhm.
It's not talking about individuals. And when we think of people, we tend to think of individual people. It's not what he's talking about. He's talking about a sense of the Russian population as thinking of them collectively and collectively having certain characteristics. Um, and the most important of those characteristics for him were what he said was these people's commitment to both the autocracy, in other words, the imperial government, and the Russian Orthodox Church.
Now, let me, what, just one, forgive me, one other kind of irreverent analogy here in terms of terminology. I think that we, uh, in recent history, in just in the United States, as different as the United States is in many ways, although you talk briefly about, interestingly, about some potential analogies, with American life,
Yeah.
but the old phrase, the silent majority, and
Yeah.
maybe even the more recent phrase, which was also kind of adopted by different political sides, sometimes in jest, of the deplorables. There's kind of like a sense that you have uh, reference or perception of somehow, the people are out there and they're different to a degree from the maybe educated, culturally high status people
Mhm.
in society. So there's a bit of that in his writing, which I think comes through in your work. There was a Russian philosopher named S.L. Frank in the 20th century who I've studied a little bit. He's not so well known, but he was an exile from the revolution. Interesting
Yeah.
life story. He was of Jewish background. He had converted to Orthodox Christianity. This was before the revolution, and he had contributed to that Landmarks book. I'm forgetting the Russian term, but it was a kind of
Yeah.
uh,
Yehi. Yeah.
yes, thank you, yes. And but Frank later wrote a book in exile called "The Spiritual Foundations of Society." And he set up a kind of dichotomy. I don't know that he was exactly on the same wavelength as Pobed Ostev, but
Pobedonostsev. Yeah.
yes, thank you. But it was similar, I think, in some ways, between that the society, that the term for a society, the what is it, the Obsesvenost, and
Obsessed. Yeah.
yeah, thank you. My wife is Russian, but my Russian is pretty terrible. So she's
My Russian's pretty rusty. I haven't used it for a
uh,
long time, but I do still know
she's
some.
unfortunately away right now, where I should have her doing this conversation because she is of course fluent. But in any case, he set up that the dichotomy between that sense of society and a term that the Slavophiles used, which you say that you note that Pobyed don't Pobyed Donetsev did not really pick up on, and that is Sobornost. So that there was this sense of a kind of
Yeah.
spiritual or mystical unity that was at odds with that sense of society, right? So I think in that sense, it's interesting to me, being in the Russian Orthodox Church, that when he was questioned, your book brings this out. One of many interesting points in your book, his correspondence with a German Protestant minister or their conversations,
I heard
where
about that. Yeah.
he's challenged about, well, why do you uh, pray to saints for their intercession, right? That's not in the Bible, right? And that
Right.
was
Yeah.
alleged. And his response is, well, this is something the people do, and so I follow
Yeah.
the
That's
people.
his response.
And on the one hand, that could be on one layer seen as a very kind of populist notion, which it is. But in another layer, that sense of Sobornost or mystical unity in the church is kind of,
Mhm.
to me there's a bit of a Venn diagram there. Even though he may not have been in the Slavophile circles,
No, he
but there's
wasn't.
still that sense of a sort of collective tradition, if you will.
Yeah.
It's related to the
Absolutely.
oral tradition in the church and the importance of that
Yeah.
through time. So anyway, yeah, lot of fascinating material here.
Yeah. His, as I said, his most important position in the government was over procurator of the Holy Synod of the Russian Orthodox Church, and it might help people understand if I explain a little bit about just what that is. There had been a patriarch of Moscow who was the head of the Russian Orthodox Church, roughly from the late 16th century on. But in 1721, Tsar Peter I, known as Peter the Great, abolished the Moscow Patriarchate. Now, it probably strikes us as very strange that a secular ruler has the authority to make that kind of radical change in the structure of a church. But in Russia, and in actually in many Orthodox Christian countries, there's very little separation between the people's government and the church. And there wasn't in Russia, but Peter wanted to bring it even more under state control. So he abolished the patriarchate and established this synod, which was a collective body, mostly of bishops, who would serve for a term, and then the membership always changed over. But he created this position called the overprocurator, and that's what it's called in Russian too, Oberprokurator, which isn't Russian; it's German. Um, but that's what this position was called. And at least when Pobedonostsev was overprocurator, he was effectively the head of the Russian Orthodox Church, even though he wasn't a churchman. He had no priestly or pastoral training at all. But he had a lot of influence over the church during those many years, 25 years that he held that position. Um, it's a structure that's pretty foreign to us Westerners.
Yeah, it's fascinating, and uh, his term in that office, I think, ended around the time or shortly after what you referred to as the first Russian Revolution, which was
Yes,
around the period of 1905. He
1905.
was
Yes,
getting older. There were a lot of disruptions and political upheaval occurring. That was around the time, also, I think, of the Russo-Japanese War, right, and the
yeah,
defeat.
1804. Yeah, in 1904. Yeah,
And by the time 1917 rolls around, and after the abdication of uh, who we refer to as our martyr Nicholas, uh,
yeah,
uh, after in that year, later in that year, there was actually a church council held, as you know, to elect the first patriarch of Moscow in a long time because of that
and recreated the patriarchate.
earlier Petrine
One of
reform.
the last issues that Pobedonostsev dealt with was there were a lot of demands being made in the very late 19th and early 20th centuries to call a council of the Russian Orthodox Church for the purpose of reestablishing the patriarchate. And Pobedonostsev was having none of it. He was strongly opposed to it, committed to the Petrine reform that created the office that he held for so long. And there was not such a council of the Orthodox Church until after the communist takeover in 1917. And then the Patriarchate of Moscow was reestablished and is still there today. And
It,
the patriarch is the head of the church.
and the council, which had been, as I understand it, in the works for a bit before the communist takeover, but
Yes.
following several years or more after Pobedonostev's tenure as
Yeah.
administrator. It was its business was never fully finished because of the communist presence. It was cut short, and then the patriarch who was elected is regarded as a confessor, sometimes referred to as a martyr, Patriarch Tikhon, because of the pressures on him leading to his death, which some people even suspect the nature of that death, under the communists. But so
Yeah,
period of a lot of turmoil of trying to our the denomination I'm in, the Russian Orthodox Church outside of Russia, our first hierarch, Metropolitan Antony, who was one of the leading bishops at that time, was a proponent of that council,
yeah,
and was present there, and that was seen as potentially returning the church more to its proper canonical form, although
yeah,
because of the ultimately atheistic views of the Bolsheviks,
yeah,
and the conflict between the church and the new state that was set up, or as it was perceived by Lenin and others anyway. It never was fully seen as taking effect. And there was, during World War II, I'm probably getting too much in the weeds here, but the the patriarchate essentially was sort of restored a second time under Stalin, at least organizationally, as he was trying to rally support for the
yes,
war against the
yeah,
Nazis. But
yeah,
Patriarch Sergius was a very controversial figure because of his earlier acquiescence to the Soviet state, as was perceived, by the
yeah,
exiled church anyway. So it's been a kind of bumpy road back. I think, just to add
yeah,
one or two other quick points of background from my limited perspective, the 19th century Russian church administratively was in this odd position, which you describe well in your book, in relation to this position that Pobedonostsev was in. Um,
yeah,
but but there had been a very vibrant growth in monastic communities and in the
yeah.
practice of
Mhm.
hesychastic spirituality, and you see this maybe most famously in the brothers Karamazov. Dostoevsky partly
Yeah,
drew on his own experiences at Optina Monastery. So I may be misremembering this, but somewhere I thought there was like a slight mention. I don't know how sincere or deep this was on Pobedonostev's part, but that maybe someday we can have a council. But he seemed so concerned, especially later in life, with all these things bubbling up in terms of what he perceived as revolutionary and negative innovations, that I,
yeah,
I can imagine, I may be imagining this wrongly, but he might have had some of the same concerns that people in the United States on a secular level have on both sides of the political spectrum about having a new constitutional convention. Which way is it going to go, right?
yeah,
Is it going to go too far in one direction or too far in another direction? And
yeah.
so perhaps that was, part of his set of concerns there, but I may be reading too much into that, but that's anyway.
Well, I think he opposed a council of the church because he wouldn't have been able to control it,
Right, right, yeah.
which he essentially did control the Russian Orthodox Church as over procurator.
Yeah.
It's a very strange arrangement where you have this man he's a government bureaucrat. He sits on the state council, which is the primary advisory board to the czar. And just like the minister of interior and the minister of justice and these other government officials, Pobedonostsev was really committed to the Russian Orthodox Church. He loved it. He really did. Um, he tried as over procurator to increase the number of Orthodox parishes throughout the country, increase the number of priests, to serve the people. Um,
I think
and
you
the
mentioned it.
spirituality of the Orthodox Church really was so one. There were really sort of two aspects of his life where he got emotional rather than intellectual. One of them was his marriage to a woman named Katya, and he was really taken with her. But the other one is the Russian Orthodox liturgy, where he's able actually to feel things rather than just think things.
And
He loved it.
reading about him biographically, and a lot of that comes through in your book. I think in Burns's book, despite the
Mm-hmm.
fact that it has gaps in it, which your book really
Yeah.
does, but he includes also a good bit of biographical background and material, I
Yeah.
think, and I got a bit of a sense of his intellectual life. It made me think of what I knew about Kant, sort of living, except Pobedonostsev was married and so forth. But Kant living in his little tower in the university town and, being
Yeah.
sort of separated from things. I think that uh, Pobedonostsev in St. Petersburg seemed to feel kind of isolated and on his own. Although he did mingle and have some things to do, important things to do with the government there. It was more for him. It was more a city of society and not a city of the people. That's
He
the sense that I
he
got.
hated St. Petersburg.
Yeah.
Or at least he always said that he did, and much preferred Moscow,
And but
which is where
his
he's from.
letters too. I don't know if his wife was in Moscow or where she was, but your book raises, it's like he was writing letters to his wife a few times a day, practically. I think it seemed that way sometimes, right?
It was a stormy romance. She was significantly younger than him, and her mother was vehemently opposed to this marriage. Um, but they got married anyway. Pobedonostsev is from Moscow, and even today, but certainly in Pobedonostev's time, Moscow was a much more Russian city than St. Petersburg.
Um,
Peter the Great created St. Petersburg
mm,
on a Western model.
right, right.
You could take most of the architecture of St. Petersburg, move it into Germany or France, and it wouldn't look out of place.
No, yeah.
That's less true. There's some of that in Moscow too, but it's less true of Moscow.
When you read about,
Um,
and again, I'm in the Russian Orthodox Church outside Russia, which
yeah,
was you could sort of call it's more than this, but given our origins in the Russian Civil War, we were associated with the kind of the Tsarist church, so to speak, in our
sure.
backgrounds.
Yeah,
So
yeah.
we have a more positive view of the last Tsar in many respects. I mean, I
Mhm.
think there are differences of opinion, but and ultimately, I think he was made a saint by our church first, and then later by the Moscow Patriarchate after communism fell, on the
Yeah,
basis of the end of his life and as being
yeah.
faithful to the
The,
faith with his family at the end of his life. But I think many of us have a more positive take on him generally than is often the case
mhm.
in the
Yeah,
world at large.
okay.
But that said, from what I remember reading about his letters and his communications with uh, his family and so forth, he would express something similar that he felt much more comfortable in Moscow, allegedly, than in St. Petersburg. And when they were
Very well be.
in
Yeah.
St. Petersburg, I think often they were, living a bit outside of St. Petersburg. They weren't usually in the actual winter
Right.
palace there. They were out in
Yeah.
Zarko Selo, or if I'm
Tsarskaya Selo.
yes,
Yeah.
thank you.
Which
So
means the czar's village.
right, because they just didn't like, they didn't like the society in St. Petersburg, and people
Yeah.
will criticize him for not being better connected in that regard. But I think the flip side of that is probably some shared attitudes, with what we're reading about in your study of.
Oh, for sure, for sure. I mean, Pobedonostsev had influence on those last two czars.
Yeah.
And he was a tutor. Now he tutored them in civil law
Mm,
and not in anything else. But I'm sure he talked to them about a whole bunch of other things, and
right.
they knew his position on things, and
You mentioned about Peter the Great and St. Petersburg, and then also a little farther back, and what you were saying about the way the church was reorganized under Peter. And,
yeah,
it's interesting, from the perspective that I've gotten anyway, Peter was looking at some of the Western states and their church organizations where you would have um, maybe to a greater degree back then than was the case even in the 19th century. But the king or the monarch would be the head of the church. You have that in the Scandinavian countries and in England and so
yeah,
forth.
Great Britain, yeah, the
And so, although
was
in
the
the
head of the
West
church.
that seemed to evolve quickly in the direction of separation of church and state, nonetheless, I mean, there was like that sort of mechanism, but the general zeitgeist or culture, was
Mhm.
quickly moving in the direction of separation of church and state. It was a complicated thing as these things were introduced into Russia, then they were they were sort of Russianized in the view of some people like Pobedonostsev, but at the same time it was a little bit up in the air. The Orthodox tradition will often look backward to Byzantium, and so an easy illustration of this in Orthodox thought is the double-headed eagle, and the idea that you have the church and the state, they're joined, but they're also somewhat
Yeah,
distinct in a way that may not be legible to Western eyes and may have been largely erased under those Petrine reforms too. But
yeah,
the
I think it
ideal
was.
was that it was almost like a bit of not only unity but a bit of check and balance sort of idea. But that was the ideal. But so they're kind of complicated cultural things behind all this, and
Sure.
again, I think your book does such a good job of shedding light on a lot of aspects of Pobedonostev's life and thinking that really not that many people know. I think people who may consider themselves conservatives in the West of whatever brand, we have we have populist conservatives now, we've got
Yeah,
neoconservatives, we got
yeah, yeah,
libertarians, whatever. But many of them, going back, I'm thinking of William F. Buckley and the National Review and so forth, way back when in the 1950s and 60s, they would
yeah,
look to Edmund Burke as a sort of lodestar, and
yeah, yeah,
and yet they would sort of probably have a very caricatured view of Russian political philosophy, even before communism, of course, And I think it's always helpful, whatever your political point of view is, to have a more nuanced and, contextualized sense of things, right? It doesn't mean,
yeah,
probably
sure.
a lot of your readers aren't going to rush off and endorse uh, Pobedonostev's views on things, but at the same time, you kind of get a sense of, well, this was a very intelligent human being who was a
Yeah,
witness to
I think
history,
so.
involved in history. We know
Yeah.
about the Communist Manifesto. We don't always think of the Autocratic Manifesto that it's involved in writing. But important history to know. So again, I really recommend this, and I'll plug this again, and we can have final comments from you if that's okay. I mean, we can go on further as well. But Reflections on a Russian Statesman by Thomas Kalnin Sorenson, and you can order this through Amazon. Is that correct? Yeah.
Yes, yes.
And it's, I guess you have actually published this, right? This was,
It's It's self-published.
Yeah. And so I don't know if that's probably the best place to order it from, though, I suspect from
Yes.
Amazon.
Yeah, yeah.
And it's based on a dissertation with archival work done in Russia. It really far outshines, in my inexpert view, but still,
Don't
I'm
know how
a reader. I'm a
expert
reader.
you is, but yeah,
It far outshines the previous work, which is still a helpful work if you're doing research on this topic. Robert
sure.
Holmes's Pobedonostsev, His Life and Thought. But I think if you're going to get one of the two, I would really recommend this. And then again, there's also this English translation. This is one reprint, but I think there's some others you can find online of
Yeah,
Pobedonostsev book, Reflections of a Russian Statesman. But I would
yeah,
argue,
that was translation of some of his essays from a collection that in Russian is called Moskovsky Sbornik, the sort of the Muscovite collection. Uh,
okay,
and somebody translated some of them, but not all of them into English in that book.
yeah. But I do think, while, it's if you're doing a study of his life and work, it's of course, and you don't know Russian, you
Yeah.
should read this. But I think you need to read both of these together because this examines a lot of his writings in Russian, which some of which you translate and quotations and segments and paraphrase.
Actually, there's a lot of translation in that book,
Yeah,
mostly from Russian, some from German,
yeah.
tiny little bit in French from French. And I I had 1 year of French. I don't really know French. I do know German, which was always better than my Russian, actually. But most of the translation in that book is from Russian.
Well, at any rate, I just think it's very helpful. I mean, we have immediate situations where it's probably helpful for educated Americans to be a bit more aware of Russian history and intellectual history and political history, given everything going on in the world today. But I
Yeah,
also think just in general, even just being exposed to some different ideas and outlooks, it's really helpful. And if you're interested in Russian literature, I'll speak again from my area. I think
yeah,
just having more of this context is super helpful. And actually, maybe that's one thing I could ask you as a sort of final question, and then we can circle back to whatever final words you might want to offer, if that's okay. And that was we were talking about this earlier off screen, so to speak, but Dostoevsky and the brothers Karamazov has his famous account of the Grand Inquisitor. Some
yeah,
people said, "Oh, that must be modeled
yeah.
on Pobedonostsev."
People have called him the Grand Inquisitor. Yeah.
Okay, yeah,
Uh, I don't think he was because I'm no Dostoevsky expert, but the Grand Inquisitor is essentially trying to protect the people from the truth.
mhm,
Um, and Pobedonostsev didn't really do that. He thought that the people had the truth, and that it was an Orthodox Christian truth, that they were committed to the Christian faith in its Orthodox expression through the Russian Orthodox Church.
mhm.
Um,
And I
he
think that
doesn't,
Dostoevsky himself, as I recall, and I know you may or may not have found this in the archives, but at least as I was taught, he had some interactions with Pobedonostsev about the
yeah.
brothers Karamazov. It was appearing in a sort of serial form in a periodical at the time. And
Mm-hmm.
after the chapter before and the chapter of the Grand Inquisitor appeared, supposedly Pobedonostsev got in touch with Dostoevsky and said in a letter or conversation, well, you're making a really good case for atheism through Ivan, who's one of the brothers Karamazov. But, what about the
Yeah.
other point of view? What about the Orthodox point of view? And Dostoevsky said, I'm going to get to that in the next few installments. And then that's where we have the accounts of Elder Zazima and his life and teachings,
Yeah.
which are really a beautiful literary presentation, I think,
Yes.
of the best of Russian Orthodox Christian
Yeah.
traditions.
Russian Orthodox spirituality, which is
Yeah.
really powerful.
So anyway, but really fascinating. Are there any final words of wisdom that you'd like to leave with us?
Well, I'll just say this about why this guy is in Pobedonostsev is important. When the Soviet Union collapsed and Russia was no longer communist, and that happened started in 1989, and the Soviet Union was dissolved on December 25th, 1991. The church, and in many ways the politics, very quickly went back to a lot of what they were before the communist revolution. Now there wasn't a czar, but the connection between the Russian Orthodox Church and the Russian people I think has really been lifted up, and you can see the historical roots of some of what's going on in Russia today in Pobedonostsev and in his political philosophy.
And like it or not, I think I've seen this in relation to some other things in Russia too, that in some ways the caricature, which was very simplistic, I think, of him, was
Yeah,
filtered through Soviet caricaturing over generations. I mean that at least
yeah,
that's what I have seen with some other aspects of Russian culture. Obviously, I have my biases, but I think
sure.
it's important to, again, I keep coming back to this to get to the kind of nuanced and fair historical presentation that you do in your book. And again, you don't have to agree with this 19th century Russian thinker, you
No.
disagree, but at least you can kind of see more of the complexity and the nuance, and I think that's a good start for trying to have a little more understanding and maybe being able to work towards some solutions to some problems even today. So yeah. So, but thank you so much, and I look forward to hoping to keeping in touch with you in the future. And I think I know your book, and also your thoughts, hopefully, in this interview will be of great interest to not only my students of Dostoevsky, hopefully, but also, as I've said, to Orthodox Christian readers in English. And also, I think anybody interested in history and world events and political philosophy. So thank you so much, and I hope you have a happy 2025, and that we keep.
You too.
Yeah, thanks. Take care now.
Thanks.
Bye.
Yeah. Bye bye.